I think kids are ready for it. They just have to pay attention. Most people just don't pay attention, either because they think everything's hopeless. I mean, it's kind of driven into your heads that everything is hopeless. There's nothing you can do. The powers are too great, you know. And in fact, the sense of hopelessness in the country is astonishing. So, for example, if you look at polls, over half the population thinks that Congress ought to be totally thrown out and replaced by your neighbors. You know, they'll do a better job. Approval of Congress is in single digits. Nobody thinks I can do anything about it. It's like these peasants in Brazil. You know, how can somebody like me do anything about it? In fact, you take a look at some of the, take say the 9/11 movement, which is kind of interesting. Not the content, but just the phenomenon. You know, the Bush blew up World Trade Center, that kind of thing. It appeals to, I mean, it has a sympathy, at least, of, I forget the numbers, I think it's about a third of the population, a huge part of the population. That means that a large part of the population is willing to accept the possibility that we're run by a bunch of homicidal maniacs who are trying to murder us all, but they don't think they can do anything about it. So they don't lift a finger to do anything. Okay, it's the way it is. We'll kind of hide in the corner and wait till it happens. But when people are kind of, I mean, some of the most effective kinds of propaganda are the kinds that allow you to see what's going on. So you see, 99%, 1%, but to feel, I can't do anything about it. I'm isolated, alone. I don't talk to anybody. People like me can't do anything. We just have to suffer and bear it. That's really effective propaganda. I mean, that's the way, that's how slavery could last forever without many slave rebellions. It's how women were oppressed. So like take, say, my grandmother's generation. If my grandmother had been asked if she's oppressed, she wouldn't have even known what you're talking about. That's life. You know, women are doormats. That's life. You get to my mother's generation, still plenty of oppression, but and she was bitter about it, but she didn't think you could do anything about it. By the time you get to today, it's quite different. It's very much like the peasants in Brazil, or the indigenous people in Bolivia, or you know, the blacks in the South after the early days of the civil rights movement. Yeah, we can do something about it, even if it's brutal and harsh, and we might get killed. We can do something. You know? And it's that transition is very. And I think when you get back to your question, for a lot of young people, I think it's, you know, it's called apathy, but I suspect it's more hopelessness, powerlessness. And people can learn you're not powerless. Just take a look at what's been done. Take a look at what other people have done under, you know, much harsher conditions than you'll ever face. And what's been done right here in your own country. The 60s really did civilize the country. I mean, it's a very different country from what it was in 1960. And it's mainly young people who just didn't give up, and didn't feel, okay, we can't do anything. Actually, sometimes it's kind of dramatic. Like for years, what's called McCarthyism, which did intimidate people tremendously. I remember I lived through it. And people were just scared out of their wits. They couldn't do anything. The House Un-American Activities Committee, if people were called, they just trembled in fear. What can you do? But in the 1960s, people like Abbie Hoffman started just making fun of them. And they collapsed, you know. It's a very thin structure of power. I mean, as soon as you submit it to ridicule or you dismiss it, it can collapse. And this has been understood for centuries. So you go back to, say, David Hume, who was one of the great founders of classical liberalism, and great philosopher, but he wrote a book that he called, I think it was called The Foundations of the Theory of Government, or something like that. And in it, he poses a kind of a paradox. He says, in every society, whether it's that feudal dictatorship, military dictatorship, semi-parliamentary system like England, whatever it is. He says power is always in the hands of the governed, those who are being ruled. Power is always in their hands. So how come they just don't overthrow the rulers and take things for themselves? He says, well, the secret, he says, always, in every society, is control of opinion and attitudes. If you can convince people, if the powerful can convince people, you have to stay in your slot. That's where you belong, and that's your role in life. There's nothing to be changed. Then the rulers can control them. And you take a look at the history of revolutions, significant changes. It's when people broke out of that. So not long before him, and he may have had this in mind, in England a century before, there was a major conflict between Parliament and the king. The Parliament is basically the bourgeoisie and landowners and so on. It wasn't the general population. And the question is the king above the law? King Charles insisted that he was above the law. The Parliament, led by jurists and others, was saying, no, Magna Carta determined that the king is subject to the law, to that time the nobles, the Parliament. And there was a real major conflict about it. In fact, later soon led to a brutal civil war. But the Parliament stuck it out and compelled the king to sign something conceding that he was not above the law. It was very, at that time, the king was regarded as a representative of God, and you didn't fiddle around with God. That's serious business. So it was essentially standing up against a kind of divine authority, not our society. That meant something then. And to break through that was very difficult, but they did. That led to constitutional parliament, to a parliamentary monarchy, which is different from feudal monarchy.